Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Yannick. I'm a software engineer here at Tynes. Happy to be here on the AI Builder series. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tynes, the company, what we're doing around AI. I'm on our AI infrastructure team and our product team, and also a little bit about the cross-provider AI infrastructure that we've built because I think we've done a bunch of really interesting things. So first, I'm going to introduce the company a little bit and talk about who we are. So, we're a technology company that powers the world's most important workflows. We were founded in 2018 by two cybersecurity practitioners. We've raised, about $1 billion, became Ireland's 11th unicorn, have some great backers, and are a partner of choice to a lot of really cool companies. We call ourselves an intelligent workflow platform, essentially allowing you to take AI, traditional deterministic workflows, the combination of humans in the loop, and sort of integrate with whatever stack that you have, right? We don't make any assumptions in terms of the type of tooling you want to connect to, the type of workflows you want to be able to do. What is important as a workflow to our customers is important to us. And we see that across all of the different things that our customers are doing. We're built to scale by design, right? We run about 1.5 billion actions a week across all of our cloud stacks. And it's really exciting, right? When you look at a lot of the customers that we have, we're trusted by their security teams, by their IT teams, by their people teams, across the board to power their important workflows. And it's not just AI, right? We've been around for a while. But when you look at AI specifically and the sort of challenge that we've seen across the board and people building in AI is that people are trying a lot. There's obviously a huge amount of investment in the space. A lot of people, both capital investment, but also adopting new tools and trying out new things. And a lot of these implementations actually fall short, right? There's proof of concepts that don't reach production, and there's this tension between the speed of the space, the way things are changing, the world that we're in now versus the one that was 2 years ago is so vastly different, especially with the capabilities, right, of these models. But on the other hand, especially when you're coming from a security and an IT background, right, there's a level of control and observability and auditability that's required of these tools. And security teams are hesitant, right, to introduce new things into their stack, especially when things are maybe a little bit more non-deterministic than what we're all used to. And so Tyne sits in the middle here, right? We've been doing workflows, like I said, for 7 or 8 years, and we have this very nice combination of human-led, deterministic, and agents built directly into the platform. When we built human-led interaction, this was well actually before agents were even a thing. We were one of the first to have a workflow and a page style interaction directly into the storyboard, allowing you to build apps to fetch logic in between multiple states. And this was important for security professionals, right? Because you would have a task or something that you wanted to kick off that required some level of human input, that it wasn't just a workflow that was going to be automated, but something a little bit, broader, right? Where you need a judgment call, you need to use their assessment and understand risk and context, right, based off of what they've seen before, right? There's obviously the determinist aspect of things where you're dealing with large volumes of alerts, mission critical workflows, things that need to always work the exact same way. um, you know Triaging events is something that we see quite a lot with our customers. These sorts of things where it can be consistent, it can be cheap, it can be dependable, right? But now in the last couple of years, we've seen the rise of agents, especially this year, right? Being 2025, where the models got to a stage where you could give them a level of responsibility so that they could take actions, whether that was fetching data, doing enrichment, building on top of existing deterministic workflows, and allowing you to say summarize the alert that you're coming in so someone can have a better high level picture of what's going on in deterministic workflows. And as the model capabilities have gotten better, we've seen more adoption, right, in the agentic space, where people are trusting the reasoning decisions of these large language models to do quite a lot, right? And at times you don't have to make a choice, right? You don't have to decide that something is fully agentic. You don't have to decide that something is fully human-led or deterministic. Depending on your business needs or your risk appetite, you pick and choose, what type of workflow you want to be able to do. And this is what it looks like, right? It's a node-based canvas where you're dragging and dropping elements together. whether we have these standard 8 elements, right, where you have your inputs, whether that's an email that's coming in, a page or a form that a user is filling out, an incoming webhook from another service that's calling onto Times, or even something that's set up on a schedule, right, to run once a week, once an hour. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take the data that you get and you're going to either enrich it with additional information, right, via an HTTP request, reaching out to essentially anything in the world that has an API. We have a bunch of nice templates. You can see in the screenshot here, we have a nice little Slack template that makes it easy to connect to things like Slack. But under the hood, right, it's just a curl. It's an HTTP request. And then you're going to transform the data in some way, right, and manipulate it so that, when you're fetching data from A, you transform it and you send it to B. This is the pattern that we see across all of our workflows, even more complex ones, right? That's what you're doing. And you might be branching and changing and doing all this sort of stuff. So that's Times as a platform, right? And that's why to us AI is really important, because AI is not, you know, uh, replacing the storyboard or our workflows. That's what we call the storyboard here. It's in addition, right? It's another tool in your toolbox that solves different problems than what you were previously able to do with just purely deterministic workflows. And that's why it has the prominence that it does, right? As our eighth action right here on the sidebar. So if we look a little bit to the past, in 2022, right, ChatGPT launched, and a lot of companies sort of rushed to build things to jump onto the hype train, right? And the models that were there were nowhere near as powerful as they are now. But we did. We were quite slow. We spent some time working on different explorations of what would look better than just something that would demo well, right? It's very easy to, especially now with tools like Cursor and Lovable and Bolt, to hack something together very quickly, right? That looks good on paper. But when you're running 1.5 billion actions a week, you have to have things that really are deterministic, that are trustworthy, that scale to the actual usage of our customers in this case. And we wanted to also build something that would reach the level of security and trust that our customers, who are very like privacy focused and all this sort of stuff, have come to expect from us. They need a level of governance. They need to understand that their sensitive data, their most important mission critical workflows, isn't being used to train these models, that it's their proprietary data, right? You can't just give it away to anyone. So we came up with these principles, right, around how we think about AI. And the most important thing first is that, like, we're not a foundational AI provider. We give access to, the latest and greatest, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI, or, if Mistral were to leapfrog ahead and bring the open source coming from Europe into the mainstream. We act as that last mile connectivity to drive real value from AI, where we view that workflows are the way that we can connect these super powerful new, not so new anymore, large language models, because we do see that in other organizations, the value that they're getting is that they can't actually have the right level of governance or connectivity that allows them to be really powerful. And so we want to, market and build to a future that actually exists today, not talk about some hypothetical future where agents are going to run around on their own and only communicate to each other, and the internet is so vastly different. We want customers to be able to actually leverage real value, and to us, workflows are that solution. And so the very first thing that we built was automatic transform. So like I said earlier, when you're interacting with data and Times, right, you're taking data from one place and you're often transforming it and converting to another. So very early on, right, we all saw that the power of AI was in one of the areas was in writing code. And it could write Python code super, super easily. And in Times, we had the ability already to host and run this Python code, through AWS Lambda. And so we created essentially this very simple interface that would, you describe what type of data transformation you wanted. It would write some Python code. It would then run the Python code against the sample input that you were testing with, and you'd see what the output was. So there was a very clear, here's the code that you can see. Here's what the output is generating. And you can sort of tweak and go back and forth to be able to get the code that generates the right thing. And you don't need to be an expert in writing code to be able to use this sort of thing. And before that, if someone wanted to transform data in Times, either they'd use and write their own Python code, or they'd use our formulas language, which we had developed as a sort of like Excel-like syntax to be able to manipulate and transform data. But that obviously requires you to learn that syntax, to read the documentation, to become familiar with it. And it's certainly more approachable than just writing code. but still has a level of learning code. So we saw that this was actually a quite useful usage of AI, especially when the models, weren't at the same level of performance that we have today. And so this was super successful, right, with all of our customers, because what exists, right, the sort of artifact that's created is, Python code that runs deterministically, that is consistent, all that sort of thing. So then we worked on a couple of other things, and we realized that around the launch of Sonnet 3.5, the models had gotten pretty good at calling tools, and what Times was good at was connecting to tools, right? Whether it was AWS, whether it was Tavili to be able to search the web if you were an agent, to connect to CrowdStrike if you're working in security. We already had a lot of this infrastructure to be able to make that secure and make that easy to do and to connect to those credentials. And we had all these templates and all this sort of stuff. So well before MCP or anything sort of existed, we were like, why don't we marry the two things together? It felt like very natural to us. So we built Workbench. And this was around the time that we actually spun up then the AI team to sort of own this area of our product, because we saw that there was going to be a lot of value. And so, you go to ChatGPT, and even now, right, with MCP and with all this stuff, if you ask to check if an IP address is malicious or is a domain bad, or, to do that sort of thing, unless you've pre-configured a tool or connected a credential or have a custom MCP server, it's not really possible for, ChatGPT to say, yeah, this is a bad domain. This looks like it's phishing. But here, you connect to VirusTotal or URL Scan, and it's able to take that IP address or that domain and actually give you the insight on it, right? Because all it's doing is that it's filling out the parameters, making the request to the service, getting the data back, and interpreting it back in natural language. Makes for a very nice, single pane of glass to interact with multiple systems that don't normally interact together. And following that, we were a workflow company. So obviously, what's the natural thing next that our customers sort of want from us? It was this idea of like, let's just put this into the storyboard. Can we call this like these tools in a sort of non-deterministic way, but triggered in our deterministic stories? And so we spent a while figuring out what was the right interface for that, so it didn't feel bolted on. We wanted to feel like a real core part of the product, right? Because clearly we saw it was going to be important. And so after a couple of iterations and a couple of months, we came up with our AI agent, right, where we give a blank canvas for customers to be able to build on top of. And these agents, right, can be connected to any tool, have any level of configuration. And, we've got two modes, which I think is fun. Task mode, which is a sort of agent in the traditional sense that you might think of, where it runs on its own, it connects to tools, it accomplishes a task, and then emits an output, right? And you can structure that information so that it returns JSON or just unstructured, markdown or text that the LLM generates. But also to go along with our sort of pages and user interaction and all that sort of stuff, we created the ability to have these like user-facing chat pages, right, where customers were and are able, right, to create a custom sort of LLM chat page, which is behind logins, where you can go in, interact with a predetermined set of tools that accomplish a task, right, allowing any IT or security help desk to create a chat interface that suits their specific business needs and their specific set of tools, which has been really, really powerful. And powering all of this, the whole reason why I'm here to talk, is our infrastructure, right? So our customers, and rightly so, are very sensitive to their data. They made that very clear to us when we started experimenting with AI, all the way back when, and we started looking at our sub-processors lists and all this sort of stuff. They were like, hey, we got to make sure that the data that you're doing isn't being sent to these LLMs, isn't being trained on, or any of that sort of thing. So when we were developing, that was obviously very important to us. So we decided to build, we're already AWS customers. We decided to build on top of AWS Bedrock, which gave us access to the latest and greatest from Anthropic, sort of serverless, in a way that meant that customers' data would stay within the same sort of geographical region, ensuring that for customers who have sensitive data that say cannot leave the European Union or the United States, that stays within those geographical boundaries. But it also meant that like their data stayed their own. It's not trained on, it's not logged. It's sort of stateless, right? It just goes to AWS, we get a response back, and AWS gets rid of it after that. And so this gives like a high level of trust to the customers. And this works well for a lot of customers, right? Because you get a good out of the box experience. If you trust Tines to be able to, build good features and do all this sort of stuff, then you can trust the infrastructure that we've built. But, we had a lot of customers that have their own infrastructure that they wanted to bring. And so, first, this is kind of what it looked like from a high level of like, here we're communicating from the Tines consensus and, reaching out to Bedrock through private link, right? The data never leaves AWS's like sphere of influence. Even the cables that the stuff is run through, like, stays within the same environment, which is quite nice. But like I was saying, customers already had their own AI providers, right? They were adopting AI at the same time that we were, both not only wanting to use it in Tines, but in other platforms and even in their own products that they were building, right? Because we're an infrastructure provider effectively, right? And so you would have teams that would, give access to AI to other teams within, especially larger organizations, right? And so you think of the likes of OpenAI, which isn't on AWS Bedrock, or Mistral, or Gemini, or XAI. DeepSeek had its moment a couple of years ago. Cohere as well. And so these companies wanted to bring their own AI providers to Tines. And so if we could make it really easy for customers to adopt AI, uh, that would be a win for the customer. They get to adopt it quicker, and they wouldn't need to like re-review and do a security review of Tines, and they could get the benefit of the products that we were building. And we decided very early on that we weren't going to resell tokens, right? This wasn't necessarily going to be something that was going to be a profit lever for us. What we cared about was building good products, and so we give customers access to a certain number of credits in Tines. But if someone wanted to bring their own AI provider, we decided, hey, this makes a lot of sense for us. So we built this translation layer. Excuse me, just needed a glass of water. So this translation layer effectively acts between Tines, right, and these external providers, where we generalize what the request format looks like. We like built our own essentially internally, translate that, have these sort of AI providers at different levels, and then translate that when we make the requests, and then we get the request back, then we translate it back into our own system. And this meant that effectively, you could go into Tines and configure a whole set of parameters for any type of AI provider, and anything that essentially has some level of chat generation text endpoint is supported in Tines, right? Where you're configuring the API key, the API endpoint itself, the additional headers, the models that might be, available. This is pretty important if, certain customers have like proxies for large sets of models, or even self-hosted AI providers where they're using their own bare metal to configure whatever AI they might have. And as we sort of developed all of these things, there were these like extra parameters that we had to start to consider, right? Where especially with self-hosted AI, you had additional function calling modes where things were being parsed slightly differently when it was coming from VLLM versus like, Ollama, right? People wanted to connect to their own infrastructure through the Tines tunnel, where they didn't want to necessarily expose their own internal endpoint to the whole wide world, and so we wanted to just directly be able to communicate it through our tunnel, and all these other fun parameters, certificates, timeouts, all of this sort of stuff. What is also enabled, right, was our self-hosted customers to have essentially the exact same experience that our cloud customers do, where it didn't matter how you wanted to use AI, but AI was available to essentially everyone using Tines. And what made this also possible was the way that we abstracted the way that AI was run. So we came up with this concept of it's not really novel, a lot of people do it, smart and fast model, where you set a default experience, which allows us to, when we're trying to make a request every single time, you don't have to like pick and choose which model, right? And so you have the likes of Workbench or agents that are going to use the smart model. But when we run Workbench, for example, we have a step where if a user has 100 tools enabled, we want to pick a subset of those tools to surface to the underlying LLM, because we don't want to like have this huge context explode, and they might enable all of these templates and all of these things. And so by pre-picking what we think is probably relevant, and we'll use an LLM to be able to do that, it makes the overall LLM experience faster, right? And so this uses the fast model, the likes of automatic transform, same sort of deal. And this was possible because of our sort of abstract generator, which is the ability to like generate a response where we're passing in that specific context that we need, the model itself, what type of model is being used, the instructions, the sort of message history, right? As we're like thinking about agentic loops or injecting things as part of the message conversation so that there's more relevant information, certain tools that might be available to the LLM, the concept of output structure that I mentioned earlier, where a workflow really needs the ability to have JSON output and structure, right, to be able to build something around it, right? Because if you just get like raw text back from the LLM, that's great and all because it has created this text. But what is actually useful for the following like parameters, right? It's fine if you want to send an email and draft an email, but not so fine if you want to extract, a list of cities from events or something along those lines. Then a couple of other configurations as well were super important. So we built this, right? Mostly because our customers were looking for it. We heard it a lot. We saw that this would enable a lot of our customers to use AI, and they wouldn't otherwise be able to, and also give them access to the latest models without us having to necessarily be customers of OpenAI or another thing. It allows everyone to be a little bit more nimble. But to be honest, you probably shouldn't do this. And I have a couple of thoughts on why. The fundamental thing is that you're probably building a product and not a platform, right? You want to be able to control the experience that you offer to your customers. When you're building something that's built on top of AI, right, there's so different experiences when using different models, different providers, even both from latency to just even the way that the models chat and interact to you. And if you're building a product, right, at least here at Times, right, we strive to build a really, really good experience. And so if the functionality is built around someone else's control of a model, then all of a sudden you have no control over the actual end user experience, which is a very big risk to your brand, to your experience, and to how your customers are going to perceive the accuracy of your platform. Where I've had to have plenty of customers with, our conversations with customers who bring, models that I will view as not performant because, they're a couple months or even years out of date. And I talk to them and I'm like, they're complaining that it's not doing what they expect it to. And I'm like, listen, when you look at the rankings, when you look at the leaderboards, these just aren't good. They're not going to call tools effectively. They're not going to generate text that works well. You're going to have a bad experience. The benefit for us is that we're a platform, right? So if people are building agents within Times and building their own things for their end users, then it's up to them to ensure that the quality of what they're building is good. It's not necessarily a reflection on Times, right? We just give them the building blocks to build and to work with that sort of thing. The other thing too is that this takes a lot of ongoing maintenance work, because the minute that someone adds a new compatible AI provider to your system, all of a sudden you realize that the term compatible isn't necessarily true. You look at, for example, when we added OpenRouter to our infrastructure, or like we were testing with it, right? We realized that what was coming back from OpenRouter wasn't actually fully OpenAI schema compatible. And so we had to like go back and figure out what was wrong. And this becomes all the more harder if people are having their own proxies and their own infrastructure and all this sort of thing. And so you have this ongoing maintenance work, which is how we ended up with a list of different configurations for customers to be able to do, and that like extra configurations options we saw earlier. Because fundamentally, you don't want to break the existing experience for customers. And so you have to figure out not an overwhelming way to have like every button and every lever that they can pull, but the right level of depth that allows for the customizability for those customers that are bringing their own models. The other thing too that you'll often run into if you're trying to build a whole host of generic providers is if you have, not enough providers, right, where you're leveraging, say, OpenAI's like sort of schema compatibility that a lot of people offer an endpoint for, you don't necessarily get to adapt the features that are provider specific. I take as an example the thinking that was released with Gemini 3 most recently. You have to pass in specific parameters and use their specific endpoints to be able to use that. And when you look at the specs and you look at how powerful these models are, if you're not able to, take the latest and greatest and leverage the intelligence, right, at a good enough depth, then you're going to miss out, right? And you might have Gemini 3, but it's not the same Gemini 3 as other people are offering, right? And that's not a good experience either. You want to avoid that. The other thing too is that like the cost to switch these things isn't that big, right? You can use you can make it really easy for yourself. You can use like model routers, for example, like OpenRouter, like I was talking about earlier, that allows you to essentially pick any AI provider from any place in a way that's super easy to do with very little cost overhead. And they're not the only ones, right? Vercel offer model routers as well. You have the likes of Helicone, right, who do both model routers and observability on top of that for understanding the types of prompts that are running through your system. You can bring your own API keys. And so you can set this up in such a way that's actually very easy for you to adapt to whatever is the latest and greatest, whether it's Anthropic leading the race or OpenAI or some other player. And then even if you wanted to build it yourself, right? In Tines, we built all of our agent infrastructure ourselves. We don't have, the only sort of packages that we're using here are to be able to make it easy to interact with, the OpenAI API or Anthropic one or Bedrock. But outside of that, we're not using an agent framework. And partially that's because everyone was building everything at the same time. We're also a Ruby house, so there isn't the same depth of libraries as there might be in more AI focused languages or that have adopted AI more quickly, like Python or TypeScript. But that has allowed us, right, to actually switch very quickly, right? Where because all of this, we can drag and drop and plug in new things when we need to because of this. And sort of fundamentally, if you're building a company and you only have a handful of users, right? You don't need to like overly abstract things, right? We have a really unique way of building here at Tines. We don't have a roadmap. We build in these monthly cycles where we break down the work that we're doing into small shippable pieces. And the work that we're doing is almost entirely driven by the feedback that we get from our customers and from the people using the app. And what that means is that instead of building this sort of theoretical version of Tines or building towards a theoretical version of Tines that we think is going to be the best for our customers, we actually build something that's good for our customers because we're listening to them every day. We're processing the feedback that they get, and we use that to influence, right, what we do. And it's been great for us because, when something is frustrating for a customer, we also feel it too, right? We dog food our own product. We were for a long time Tines' biggest customer and no longer, which is a very exciting place to be. But it means that like we're, sort of working in pieces to be able to get there. And so like when I even take the example of building this generic AI infrastructure that can sort of connect to anything, it wasn't something that we just like decided, okay, 4 months from now, we're going to have this like super thing that can connect to everything. But we built a first version, right? We just allowed you to connect to your own API key from OpenAI. And that was it. There was no additional configuration. There was no parameters. And we were there and we're like, okay, that's great. This works. Let's now add the option to pass in your own base URL. So now this opened up to a whole host of things. And we got feedback being like, well, our provider doesn't support this. And we added this parameter. We need headers and credentials to be able to be passed in securely. And so we built that. And it allowed us to build something that our customers actually wanted rather than something that was theoretical. And had we, started off building something that was super generic, we would have come into, these premature abstractions, this technical debt that you'll see quite a lot in a lot of companies, and you'll run into a lot of issues. So unless you're a platform, I'd recommend not doing this. What you can do is you can offer the option for your customers to bring their own API keys, right? Making sure that like if you pick what the model it is you're running under the hood, then you can guarantee the type of experience that they're going to have. But other than that, just don't do it. So thank you all for your time. I hope you guys found this interesting. If you have any questions, I'm going to take a look at the chat here, and I'll answer them.
Great stuff, Yannick. Let's see. While people are asking questions, can you speak to me about like the observability or behind what you guys are doing? Like what?
Oh, I think your mic has cut out there, but I'll talk about a bit about the observability.
Yeah.
What we've done, so we've given our customers the sort of assurances that our data, we're not training based off of our data. So there's actually a limited amount of things that we're looking at. Predominantly, we listen to the feedback from customers, right? In terms of like, how does it feel for them to interact with it? That was a lot of like gut feeling. We'd written a bunch of infra for doing, tests and against things, what we found was that it was actually hard over time to ensure that like when we had a sort of submission of this is the way that the AI, especially for Workbench, was experiencing, where here we've got a little bit more of a package solution for customers to be able to use, that as the models change, it's actually quite hard because, if this model doesn't work this way, you have like a weird experience and it's like, it's actually just a model thing. The test very quickly ran out of date. What we can do though is we can look at like the volume of usage, right, for specific features. That's been a very indicating feature for us. So say, for example, a little while ago, we shipped the ability to generate formulas, so the sort of times-based formulas, and so we provided like documentation to the LLM and all this sort of stuff, so it generates all the formulas. We see that being used over 50 times a day. And what's really interesting about that is that Tines itself, right, we have hundreds of customers, and the people aren't building in Tines all the time, right? You build a workflow, you put it up in the background, you let it work, and you don't want to like change it at that stage. So the fact that we're actually seeing quite a lot of engagement on that is a really telling sign to us that it was something that like provided a lot of value. And a launch that we had today is around like building with AI and Tines and having a sort of like co-pilot experience directly in the storyboard. And we've already seen a lot of like, from the people who have tried it, a lot of positive feedback on that sort of thing. And really it's, whether you're tracking it, depending on the agreements that you have with your customers, or you're looking at the success or someone thumbs up a reaction or whatever. That is a really good indication though of like how people are building with your stuff. Yeah, so evals, to sort of follow there, that Michael asked. It's hard. It's so hard. Like I was saying, it gets out of date really quickly. Your product, right? We're a team now of almost 50 people. The product that you're building and the experience that you're building changes so fast. Either you have to be very keen and structured to be able to do it, or just go off of a little bit of gut feeling, right? I think that there is a lot of value in having strong evals and strong infrastructure to be able to do it, especially if you're working in a sort of agent framework that allows you to do that sort of thing. Whereas we have to sort of roll everything ourselves. But we've gotten this far by essentially providing baseline tools for our customers to build those sorts of things. And it puts us in a unique position, right? Where only now do we have like very structured product experiences that are AI based, rather than just like, here are some buttons that you can click to build an agent and you configure your output. And for our customers, what we've done effectively is like, we give them everything, right? They have every bit of logging that they need. They get the whole conversation history at the end of it. They see all of the tools that will run all of the inputs. So if they want to plug that into their own observability tool or track, what is the customer interaction, right? That's just adding another action to the storyboard and sending the data to another platform, or even in Tines to like validate, does the response include this type of expected behavior, those sorts of things.
Awesome. Just on that, right? A lot of companies are now working. So engineers and data scientists are kind of working more and more together, right? Like,
yeah.
Can you speak a bit about that at times, and like, what is the handover, and how the data team and the software engineering team are kind of closely knit together?
Yeah, our data team is very small. And so a lot of the observability that we do, we use a platform called Omni that we pipe our data effectively to from AWS to S3 to then Snowflake and then into Omni, so that we can like build visualizations and dashboards and all this sort of stuff. Really, the closeness of what we're doing is with them is making sure that we're tracking the usage that's happening, right? Tracking across customers. That's both useful for us as engineers, also for the sales folk who are like looking at how things are being consumed, what are their customers doing, because we want, everyone in the company wants to make sure that the customers are successful, and those, especially on the sales side, want to have like a good understanding of, their customers' use case and identify early on, hey, we've launched this new exciting feature, we told you about it, and you're not actually using it, right? That is a negative indicator that then gets fed back, whether it's something that we see in these dashboards that are being built or that we build ourselves. But having like a sort of single pane of glass, an easy place to be able to query that data and to do that, especially in our case, we're multi-stack and multi-region. So, we have to feed all of our data into a central location to be able to look at all this sort of stuff is quite important. So we want to make sure that, we do so in a way that's like effective, right? And they're very good. They're very nimble. They, whenever we ask them like, hey, can we find this? They're like, yeah, probably. They get back to us in a short period of time. So we have great colleagues in that sense. Fine tuning. I personally, might be a hot take. I know some people I fall on either side of the equations. The benefits you might get from fine tuning are very fall into very niche categories, right? So when I look at like we again, like I was saying, up until recently, we haven't shipped features that are generic or specific features, right? We've shipped generic platform things that people interact with, and the way that they're interacting with it is so broad and varied, from IT to HR to security, right? Like our bread and butter, that like everyone is doing things slightly differently. And so having something that is specific, we tried early on in the GPT 3.5 days around like formula generation and that sort of thing, and saw for the amount of time that it took to be able to do an investment and all this stuff, not enough returns at the time to continue to look down that path, especially given that like the amount of data that you need to be able to make these things successful, right? Again, we promise our customers we don't train on it, so either has to come from ourselves in times or synthetically, right? That's quite hard. I think that the space has changed quite a lot since then, right? Where there is now a whole host of open source and extremely cheap models that we could benefit from to do very specific use cases. But the risk, right, of fine tuning is getting absolutely leapfrogged by a new foundational model that's twice as good, right? And we've seen that. The last year has been crazy. This time last year, if you told me that I could trust an agent to like do a large portion of even my own development work and sort of be leading a lot of the work that I do rather than me using it effectively as a smart autocomplete, would have been crazy to me. But this is now the sort of world that we're working in as a software engineer. And those same generic improvements that have improved the models in sort of all of these spaces also apply to Tines, right? That's why, we've thought about story building and with AI and Tines for a long time. It's one of the first things we experimented with, but it's nothing that we shipped because it just wasn't a good enough experience. It wasn't fun. With the launch of Sonnet 4.5, the sort of price to performance started to make perfect sense, and the ability of what was capable and the way we could define the tools and its ability to understand the time specific context worked really, really well. And so, we're not as small as you guys, but still a small engineering team. And so for us to like dedicate time, our backlog of things is effectively infinite. You got to pick and choose what your priorities are. And if we know that we're going to see improvements from the improving of large language models, then feels like a safe bet to stay in that lane and focus on the product experiences, the how people are interacting with it, and the ways that we can like leverage, the latest tools and technologies. Any tools you strongly recommend? I mean, other than like the traditional, like use Cursor, use Claude Code to like, do fast development, I think the best thing that we found as an org is like using these AI tools to like quickly spike something together. I think it's really exciting to be able to see something in real before you actually go and build it in a thing. You can find out whether something makes sense to actually invest into or not from like an actual human engineering side. That's actually really huge for like general product development. With AI agents, testing with stuff like OpenRouter has been really helpful for me so that I can understand the different providers and their experiences, like depending on what a customer is using. And lastly, just use the AI models, understand them, right? Like it's kind of weird to like say that like go understand how this works, but they have personalities is not the great word, but they have different like vibes to them. They interact in different ways. They perform differently. Like if you've tried tool calling with Gemini 3, you'll find that it's just weird. There's no other word to describe it other than it like isn't maybe that good sometimes, but you can see that there is a high level of intelligence in the model, right? And that's been true of the Gemini models for like a number of series now, right? And that comes from the gut feeling that you get by using it over time. It's very hard to quantify, but those are kind of like the things I would look at. And we use AI across the board, like within the org and software security. Essentially, the very first time that a human reads your code is not the first time that your code should have been reviewed. You'll have both. We built our own like review bot that like does like your review of the code. Cloud Code also has like a security review plugin feature thing that you can just do to be able to see how that works. And on top of that, the security team here also uses a number of tools to be able to help flag changes that might be malicious or bad in some way. And so you'll see a dry run security bot that will look at the code and be essentially overly optimistic, right? And these are, to me, some great use cases for AI. And that's because, what is the risk of it getting it wrong? Essentially zero, right? If it says the wrong thing, we can look at it and I figure out why it said the wrong thing or made the wrong assumption. But if it gets it right, then that's a great catch. And this happens for, I've only been in the team for the last 2.5 years, but you look at people who've been around for a lot longer. Like, it's not only just for me, but for across the entire organization. And actually, when you look at our cursor usage, senior engineers and staff and principal engineers are using AI more than the more junior engineers, which is an interesting balance, right? And I think I've seen that that's true across a lot of different organizations, right? Where now that the models are good enough, there's been this huge increase across the board and a shift, right, in terms of how these people do it. If I were to make a guess, right, these are people who have been used to telling other people what to do for a while, right, and delineating and giving out work more than a junior engineer might be. But that's just me, like, thinking about stuff. And do we build workflows using Times for our development team? Yes, we do. We, like I was saying earlier, we're like our biggest customer, essentially, or were for a while, not anymore. Our entire everything that is automated in Times effectively is automated by Times. So our deployment pipeline on the engineering side is entirely powered by Times, right? When tasks get kicked off, notifications that are sent to GitHub, to Slack, all of that is powered by Times. When you look at like all of our like internal IT and security help desks, these are pages that people have built, or chat AI things that have been built directly in Times. Any data processing, a lot of our like marketing stuff that can be automated has been automated with Times. Legal reviews for submitting documents and like working with Deal Desk and all this sort of stuff is powered by Times, right? Anyway, we're like a lean team. Any way that we can make it faster, we do believe in the product, and that's because we use it all the time and we see its value. And I think that like you can check out Times for free, by the way. If you go to times.com, there's a community edition that's free and always free. You can play around with it, do it, see what it's like, and try it out and see that there's actually value in it. So MCP agent skills. MCP, I didn't necessarily believe it was going to be any good when it was launched. It's a standard that is a little bit repetitive, that doesn't need to exist. We've had things like OpenAI specs and descriptions of APIs for a long time. Not that like a majority of people were like building them or making them useful, right? But it's essentially a reinvention of the wheel. But it's useful in the sense that now it's been adopted, right? So, as much as I might think that the spec might be a bit messy and security around it, especially in the early days where it was just absolutely hot garbage, right? It was all like running locally on your local machine and all this sort of stuff. It has matured quite a lot. Companies are adopting it, and any tool that a company is adopting is important, right? In the same way that like, we don't care what HTTP curl that you're making within Times, you can connect to MCP server in Times because we're meeting our customers where their tools are, and we'll continue to do that, right? Agent skills and these sorts of things, right? Again, it's effectively markdown, right? But as long as there's a standard that's adopted, right, by multiple providers, I think that that's quite useful, right? We've recently moved all of our internal cursor rules to using the agents.md format because Cursor decided to adopt it. Now it means that, if engineers are using Claude Code or Cursor, or both at the same time, that the rules are in one standardized place, right? And the least amount of copying and pasting we have to do, the better.
Awesome. I think we're at time, Yannick. If there's any follow-up questions, I'll be sure to send them on to you and you can address them there. Yannick, thanks very much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great presentation. It'll be live, or sorry, we'll publish it on YouTube so people can look back on it. Really insightful. So thanks very much for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us. And thank you everybody for joining. The next stream will be on the 19th of February. In the meantime, you can get involved on our LinkedIn page, YouTube page, and we'll be also publishing a Discord community soon as well. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Yannick, thanks very much. Talk to you all soon.
Cheers.
Bye. Thanks.